Chris, and yes, bipartisanship will be a theme of my speech this morning, and it's true that I do co-host a program with Christopher every Friday. I enjoy doing that, and it's also true that Christopher and I are actually friends, although we'd prefer that you all keep that a secret. There are a number of our colleagues who keep remonstrating with us that if we continue to display this level of public friendship across the aisle, it's going to undermine the entire political process. So we try to keep that to ourselves. And it's also true that there are aspects of the way Christopher's performing his job that I would be happy to commend him for and compliment. Unfortunately, remarks about that are at a security classification which prevents me from being able to share them with you today. But criticism of Christopher is at a level where I can freely divulge upon that, and I intend to do so during this speech. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Can I also acknowledge Peter Jennings and thank you for inviting me here today. Certainly speaking at ASPI really does force me to test my thinking against some of the most experienced minds in the world of defence. And with that, I'd also like to acknowledge all the representatives of defence industry here today and the senior representatives of the Australian Defence Force. Good ideas have long half-lives. The 2016 White Paper talks about how important it is that we invest widely in systems that work together to get the best performance from platforms across the services, throughout the joint, throughout the integrated space. And the First Principles Review also emphasised the need for a more integrated armed forces, for one defence. All of this, of course, is hard to argue with. And in part that's because it's an idea that's been a part of every white paper, one way or another, back to 1987, and the process of integration dates back further, to the Whitlam government and prior to that. It's as true today as it was then that we need a defence procurement and industry policy that gets the most from every dollar and every asset. And it's defence industry which is the subject of my address to you today. The importance of having a defence industry as part of a strategic sovereign capacity is also as true now as it's ever been. And what's really interesting is that we are hearing that in a white paper that's been delivered by a Conservative government. Because historically, there has been a divide in the way the major parties have approached defence industry. Labor has long held the view that a significant defence industry not only provides high-end manufacturing jobs to Australians, but also adds to our nation's sovereign capability. It serves a strategic purpose. During the Second World War, the idea of sovereign capability saw Australia manufacture an aircraft, the Wirraway. But in a contemporary sense, with complex global supply chains, which make it impractical for Australia to totally manufacture much of the equipment our armed forces require, the idea of sovereign capability was set out in the 1987 Defence White Paper, and I quote, "The capacity to maintain, repair, modify and adapt defence equipment to the Australian environment independently of overseas sources is of fundamental importance for our combat effectiveness in all levels of conflict." A commitment to an Australian defence industry has never been a part of the Coalition's DNA. They have never had a preference for Australian-made equipment. The first term of the Abbott-Turnbull government showed this blind spot remained. They were open to submarines being built in Japan. They have sent the supply ships off to Spain. But it is true that something changed. Under this government, Australia lost manufacturing jobs on a scale that we hadn't seen before. Before this government, Australia made cars, now we don't. The industry simply doesn't exist here anymore. Ideology really prevented the government from intervening when it mattered, and as a result, the government has faced a jobs crisis, particularly in the states of Victoria and South Australia. And that's when the government latched on to defence industry as a political solution. Government intervention could not be as easily criticised by conservative thinkers because government in this sector is the only client. Intervention is necessary and cannot be avoided. A defence industry push offered an opportunity that would give government a way to claim action on manufacturing job losses. And accordingly, before the last election, a commitment was made to build the submarines in South Australia, and post the election, the Industry Minister became the Defence Industry Minister, which gives us the clearest insight into the fact that defence industry now represents the totality of the government's broader industry policy. The Coalition's conversion on the road to Damascus about defence industry, in my view, is shallow and expedient, but we will take it. It's hard to know how long-lived this commitment to Australian industry will be, but at least for now, they have belatedly arrived at a place that Labor has occupied for generations. And combined with both parties' election commitments to spending 2% of GDP on defence, defence industry policy is now bipartisan, and that is good, because it should offer the opportunity to rise above partisan politics and give the ADF and the broader defence community a sense of long-term direction about defence industry policy. But sadly, this is an opportunity that the government seems often determined to miss. In the last sitting fortnight, my counterpart Christopher Pyne answered 5 Dorothy Dixes in question time. In them, he extolled the virtues of the government's actions in defence industry. That's completely fair enough. That is his job. But he also tried to turn that into a political attack, asserting Labor was on a different page when it came to defence spending and defence industry. His attack boiled down to his final quote, his final sentence before time ran out, and I quote, "This is a government that takes defence and defence industry seriously, unlike the joke on the other side." This, of course, is silly. It's politics for politics' sake, and it's wrong. Christopher claims a continuous shipbuilding capability as an existing achievement of the Abbott-Turnbull government and accuses Labor of creating the Valley of Death. Again, in answer to a Dorothy Dixer, he said, "We have 54 vessels that we have commissioned in 4 years of this government. How many were there under Labor? Not one, 0. Absolutely nothing in 6 years. Labor had a naval shipbuilding plan. It was called the Valley of Death. It was like a B-grade movie title. What they left in naval shipbuilding was a desert, absolutely no commitments to one ship to be built in this country in 6 years." Politicians of all stripes pick stats that support their argument when they're making a case. But to be honest, this argument relies on ignoring facts altogether. Here is a fact. Under the former Labor government, the skilled workforce in shipbuilding had grown to over 4,000 people in yards including Williamstown in Melbourne and Four Jacks in Newcastle. The Valley of Death was a foreseeable moment. The LHDs and the air warfare destroyers would be completed before building of the future frigates and the offshore patrol vessels started. The hard part wasn't seeing it coming. The hard bit was having a plan to do something about it. And Labor's plan was to have the supply ships built in Australia and to bring forward the construction of the OPVs, closing the Valley of Death and keeping people in work. But after 4 years of the coalition government, the supply ships are now being built in Spain, and we still haven't got a preferred bidder on the OPVs. The Valley of Death is as wide as ever, and we're sliding into it. 1,500 naval shipbuilding jobs have been lost. Williamstown and Four Jacks are all but a standstill. Aside from the impact this has on the families of those who are now out of work, for the nation it means we've lost skills, which we'll need to reacquire later at a huge cost. Measured by jobs, it is beyond question that naval shipbuilding, which is at the heart of the government's defence industry policy, has gone backwards under the coalition. Now, in truth, much of this occurred during the government's first term, when defence industry policy seemed to be about everything other than defence industry. For the first term of the Abbott-Turnbull government, Australia's defence industry was simply a card to be played in the government's free trade agreements. They put Korean construction of the supply ships on the table to try and close the Korean free trade agreement. They used the same ploy with submarines and the Japanese. Now, while neither of these ultimately eventuated, these ideas were in play at points along the road, which belied any genuine considered commitment on the part of the coalition to use the opportunity of these acquisitions to help build an Australian defence industry, particularly in the maritime space. In February of 2015, the country was exposed to the full cynicism of the government's thinking on defence industry when Senator Sean Edwards of South Australia revealed his support for besieged Prime Minister Abbott had been assured by the Prime Minister committing to build the future submarines in Adelaide. Now, whatever the ultimate merits of this decision, what became clear was that the single biggest procurement in the history of the Commonwealth and the lion's share of Australia's defence industry was being tossed around the government party room as part of a power play in a leadership challenge. These actions treated the Navy, Australian shipbuilders and the Australian public with a profound contempt. And I welcome the government's decision to pursue Australian jobs with a local submarine build, but not for a second do I believe this is the result of deep thought. It's politics, not policy, which drives this government. Of course, perhaps the clearest exhibition of contempt shown to the Australian defence industry was when Defence Minister David Johnson said he wouldn't trust ASE to build a canoe. Now, to be fair, these were the comments of one man, which probably ultimately cost him his job, but it does leave an uneasy sense of what truly lies in the heart of government members when they think about Australian workers and shipbuilders. Playing politics didn't stop when Malcolm Turnbull moved into the Lodge. It's still the main feature of the way in which the government articulates this space. Christopher Pyne continually claims that defence spending under Labor fell to its lowest level since 1938. He bases this claim on the proportion of defence spending to GDP in 2012-13, which was indeed 1.6% of GDP. But he fails to acknowledge that in 2002-2003, under the Howard government, spending was at 1.62%, just marginally more. Nor does he mention that under Labor in 2009-10, it was at 1.93%, a higher figure than at any time during the Howard government. He also conveniently ignores that in Labor's last budget in 2013, defence spending was at a record $114 billion over the forward estimates. Christopher likes to claim that under Labor, no new naval shipbuilding programs were commenced, as if the current extensive shipbuilding program commenced the day he was sworn in as Defence Industry Minister. But here's the truth. The LHDs started under the Howard government in 2003 and construction on them commenced in 2009 under the Rudd government. The air warfare destroyers were initiated in 2001 under Howard and construction commenced in 2010 under Rudd. The future frigate and the offshore patrol vessel were both initiated in 2009 under Rudd, but the Abbott-Turnbull government hasn't started construction on either. And the future submarines were initiated under the Rudd government, and we all know that construction is a long way off in respect of it. The one program which has started since the 2013 election is the Pacific Patrol vessels, initiated in 2014 under Tony Abbott, and construction on them is also a long way from starting. But the real point is this: big projects like these are implemented over many governments. The Collins program started before my career did, and it will finish about the same time as my kids' careers end. And it's puerile. I mean, it really is, to suggest that any particular government has a monopoly on any of these projects. What matters is that each project enjoys bipartisan support, and they do. And political considerations around announceables and their timing in respect of the last election has put into play real questions about our current procurement plans. Has the submarine tender been done in the most competitive way? Will construction on the frigates really start in 2020? And has all the work been done to ensure the greatest Australian industry content is in place in the supply chains for the maritime projects. Now, the point of making these observations is actually not to make partisan gain. It is actually precisely the opposite. If we all agree on the direction of policy, and if the implementation of the defence industry program is unlikely to be a battleground at the next election, and it won't be, then to pursue partisan politics is indulgent. It serves no practical purpose. And I'm not a prude when it comes to partisan politics. When real ideological differences exist between political parties, it is crucially important that it gets argued out. The contest determines elections, and to be sure, I really want to win the next one. But if we are operating in a space where the difference is small and the political environment is not volatile, then we must all meet the challenge of rising above our political habits and reflexes and seek a different discussion. Such a discussion does not preclude us from holding the government to account or pursuing areas of real difference, but it does offer a more thoughtful, deeper discussion which is in the interests of our defence community and ultimately our nation, and also provides certainty and policy stability. And in my opinion, we desperately need a discussion like that in the field of defence industry, because it isn't clear to me that a fully conceptualised rationale around Australia's defence industry is currently being articulated. And let me explain that. Last December, I visited Israel and toured facilities at IAI, Elbit and Rafael. The experience was illuminating. First, I watched young IDF soldiers experimenting with an updated model of a broader management. First, I watched young IDF soldiers experimenting with an updated model of a border management system Elbit was developing. The soldiers' role was to work with Elbit to refine the system's capabilities, and the interaction between them and those working for Elbit was scintillating. The insights provided by the IDF personnel were not rocket science. They were just practical, sensible ideas from people who operated the system in real environments. Their influence on the quality of the system was profound, but what struck me most was the total sense of shared mission. The line between the interests of Elbit and the IDF for this system was non-existent. Israeli company and Israeli Defence Force were as one. Now, I know we have our own examples of real war experience influencing homegrown product development. The Bushmaster is a really great example. In fact, this is a local example, which is exactly what proves the point about what we can achieve here on a domestic product when we generate the same compelling organic interaction that was on display for me with the Israeli defence industry and the IDF. The second observation was that while the IDF is a major customer for each of these three companies, the majority of their business is offshore. They knew the innate lumpiness of the requirements of just one defence force made it hard to sustain a continuous business. But exports provide the volume that allows ongoing product and workforce skills development. And finally, I was struck by the workforce profile of these companies. These were mainly scientific and engineering houses, literally thousands of tertiary qualified workers, many with PhDs, provided the engine rooms of companies which were at the very top of the technological ladder. Israeli policymakers are in no doubt that the amazing startup nation which is Israel today has its roots in the defence industry. And so I came away wondering whether you could really have a defence industry that didn't export. I also pondered whether there existed an Australian defence industry company that employed thousands of people which could claim a majority of its work as being export. And I can really only think of one. I couldn't shake the question about whether we as a country have really committed ourselves to developing a defence industry as a national endeavour, as clearly as the Israelis had. Now, of course, Israel's situation is clearer. An existential threat hanging over that country for its entire life, combined with an uncertain ability to acquire defence materiel abroad, has given them no option but to pursue an indigenous defence industry. Their national mission is clear. But in part, that's my point, because how clear is our national mission? You know, we all agree that as we acquire significant military equipment, the more of it we can build in Australia, then the better for the Australian economy and Australian jobs. And Labor also knows, as I've stated, there's a strategic benefit in improving our sovereign capability. But I believe we actually need a deeper argument. If we are going to take developing a national defence industry beyond the realm of political rhetoric and make it a true national mission. Because right now, it actually feels to me like we are half pregnant on the question of committing to a defence industry. While our military leaders support the Australian defence industry, an honest assessment would suggest it's not their first priority. And let me be crystal clear, that in no way is a criticism. In the absence of a bigger, consistent argument at the political level, their interest is rightly in acquiring the best equipment that will keep our soldiers, sailors and aviators safe while giving them ascendancy on the battlefield. Who could argue with that as a priority, as the priority? And who could argue that with this as the number one priority, where the equipment is built becomes a secondary issue? Yet the problem is that developing an Indigenous defence industry is a really big endeavour. Without complete and unanimous effort and buy-in from our political leadership, our senior military, our foreign service, our treasury, totally committed to this as a national endeavour, I fear it won't be sustainable, particularly under a future Conservative government which is not reacting to the loss of a car industry. We need a sustained national discussion to answer the fundamental question about why we want this industry as distinct from any other industry. This discussion needs to identify the realistic opportunity our current military acquisitions provide to leverage an Indigenous defence industry for the future. And I believe the answer to this question lies in the way we answer the question about the need for a defence force in the first place. You know, of course we need a defence force to defend our home, but we also want one that will play a part in the way Australia projects into the world. We are a middle power with a greater need than most to be able to guide our own way in the world, because we're not in ASEAN or the African Union or the EU. It's true, we have a big friend, but in large measure, we need to project on our own. We need to be taken seriously. And playing our global part and being taken seriously in the region and beyond requires a significant defence force. The ADF is essential in that projection, but an exporting defence industry could really complement that mission. American power is about aircraft carriers and the Marines, but it's also about being the home of Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin. The current naval shipbuilding program in Australia is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create an exporting Australian shipbuilding industry. We do some exporting now, to be sure, but if we get it right, we can do a lot more. Combined with some excellent niche technologies we've developed in Australia, there is an Indigenous defence industry to be had. But to do so, we have to firstly reject petty partisanship. We must explore all the possible policy options available to us in a way that transcends the party politics of the day. And most of all, we need to know why we, as a nation, want a defence industry and commit to it at every level of government and the military and in this bipartisan way. Australian jobs, to be sure, is part of the reason. Developing a high-tech industry matters as well. Sovereign capability is essential. But ultimately, an exporting Australian defence industry can magnify the role our defence forces play in projecting our nation abroad and allowing Australia to take its place as a prosperous, peace-loving country in the community of nations. Thank you.